Welcome to the Fix Harare podcast, brought to you by Harare News. My name is Tawanda Mudzonga. I'm the editor of Harare News, and joining me today is the managing editor, Henry Munangatire. Hey, Henry.
Hi, Tawanda. How are you? It's good to be back. Very excited for this week's discussion about a major issue in our city.
Absolutely. So far, we have spent each episode of the Fix Harare podcast talking about the main aspects of service delivery systems that are not working the way they should. But overall, there's a need for a new vision for how this city works. Cities all over the world reach a point where the population grows and the infrastructure has to keep up with it. The way Harare was designed and currently operates has to grow to accommodate the people who now live in it. To help us navigate this idea of having a vision for this city moving forward, this week we are talking to Mike Davies. Mr. Davies is the former chairman of the Combined Harare Residents Association, also known as CRA. He's a community organizer and has been an urban activist for over 30 years. Welcome to the Fix Harare podcast, Mr. Davies.
Thanks very much, Tawanda. Pleasure to be here.
Mr. Davies, can you please tell us about yourself and your history with service delivery locally?
Well, firstly, please call me Mike. I've been involved with service delivery in the City of Harare, firstly as a writer in a local newspaper when I used to write on service delivery issues back in the early 90s. And then I was part of the movement to set up residents associations that began in 96. And from 2004 to 2008, I was chair of the main residents network, the Combined Harare Residents Association. After leaving the Residents Association, I'm still involved as a member, but I set up the service monitoring and reporting tool for Harare, which was an app that you could use on your telephone to report service delivery issues. I don't think Zimbabwe was ready for that at that time, so that only lasted a couple of years. I currently work as chair of the Urban Farming Association of Zimbabwe, which is a trust that promotes sustainable utilization of our green spaces for the benefit of all our citizens. So I have a long history of engagement in local affairs in the city of Harare.
Okay, Mike, we brought you here to talk about service delivery and the history of it. When and how did service delivery in the city start falling apart?
Well, it's important. If you want to understand a process, you have to understand how it arose and what were the forces that give play to that process. We must always remember the city was founded as a colonial city. It was intended for the benefit of the few, and the vast majority of people were physically excluded from living in the city. With independence in 1980, the city was opened up and there was massive immigration into the city as people looked for new opportunities to make a living. This was not part of the original master plan for the city, which, as we know, was based on an elite ruling over a subjugated mass. With the arrival of the immigrants in the city, these immigrants generally provided low financial contributions to city revenue. They were tenants or lodgers in houses, paying rents to landlords, and were not contributing to the city's revenue, although, of course, everybody contributes to national revenue. So there was this increasing strain on the revenue base of the city as it moved from a colonial city into an independent city. For me, I would mark the turning point as 1996, with the arrival of the executive mayoral system, this concentrated a lot of power in a single person, in a mayor. The mayor at the time was Solomon Tawengwa, who turned out to be grossly corrupt, from the Boca tobacco floors, I'm sure you remember, to various petrol stations. He really set the seal on the rampant looting at the City of Harare. And the City of Harare, I think, in that year, went from a service delivery institution to a kleptocracy. Remember, the City of Harare is bigger than most ministries. It's probably the second biggest enterprise in the country. It has huge revenues. And what we've seen since 1996 is a bloated bureaucracy that swallows up more than 80% of the revenues, and endless corruption cases, directors being suspended. You never hear about it again. Some of them go to jail, but not many. So there's this culture of thieving and corruption, which has parasitized the revenue stream.
Okay, and so the thievery, the corruption, which the revenue that residents pay, this money is being stolen. Is that the reason why we are not getting service delivery?
It's certainly one of the major reasons. The money is not necessarily being stolen as such, but is being siphoned off through various actions. The salaries in the City of Harare are 2 to 3 times higher than those of our national government. This is completely unacceptable. To spend 15,000-20,000 on a city director when you could get a competent person for 2/3 of that price, maybe.
Sorry, Mike, are you saying that directors are being paid $15,000 a month?
Certainly the town clerk with his allowances and such is probably in that ballpark. I would have to check the latest. But this brings me to one of my big issues, is that we just don't know. The city is secretive. It does not release data. Some years ago, we called upon the city to implement an open data policy where all revenue and accounts are freely available to citizens to investigate. So there's been a lot of misinformation. I may be wrong on the current figure, but certainly the bureaucracy is bloated and overpaid. And until we bring the wage bill down to not more than 30% of revenues, the City of Harare will never be a viable enterprise. So that's an essential part of any moving forward, is that the bureaucracy is trimmed and the pay scales are brought into alignment with those of the national government.
Okay, so we've talked about the money that is needed to provide the service. What about the systems? By that I mean residents being able to report and tell council this is a problem, and them turning around and actually doing the work. Is there still a culture of an understanding of the fact that service delivery is an important part of the mandate of City of Harare and doing it on a regular basis?
You know, it's brave to try and stop the leaking dam wall by yourself with a finger. But when the dam wall starts to collapse, you better get out the way. Our city is in such a state that there's very little chance of rectifying any of our local issues until we have a national solution to our political problems.
Well, I guess my next question is about the ordinary resident who lives, you know, whether you live in the north, south, east, or west of the city, and you pay your rates and you have rubbish sitting in your yard for months at a time and it's being uncollected. What are 3 things we need to do as residents to improve service delivery?
Well, I'm not someone who believes that individual actions are enough in themselves. Yes, residents must reduce, reuse, recycle, and refuse plastic and other wastes that cannot be utilized in their properties. When you go shopping, do not take plastics and other things because you're creating garbage. Take your own reusable bags. Make sure you have, if you can, have a couple of chickens to eat your vegetable scraps. And it's amazing how much you can reduce your ecological footprint through conscious shopping. Many people in the high-density suburbs, they have a basket and they go to the woman on the corner of the street and they buy their stuff. They don't generate nearly as much rubbish as the northern suburbs with all their plastic and etc. So the first thing you can do as an individual is reduce the amount of garbage that you are generating for the city of Harare. This is our responsibility as citizens on Earth, to be aware of the pollution problem, the environmental crisis, and act accordingly. However, as individuals, there's only so much we can do. We need to come together, and the story of my life in this field has been community organizing, developing collective voices, getting people to meet with their neighbor, talk about their common issues, to meet with their neighbor's neighbor, and come together and speak with a unified voice. Unfortunately, in our political culture, there's no respect for dissenting voices. We don't have a culture anymore of the dare, of sitting down under a tree, discussing the issues, and even if it takes ages, thrashing out some solution that is acceptable to most people. We've become an authoritarian culture where it is my way or the highway, where the central government or anyone in authority has become used to telling us what to do. So we need a systemic change. We need to go back. We need vigorous, dynamic residents' associations that can aggregate the voices of individuals and put real pressure on officials. I was about to say elected officials, but in Harare we don't seem to have our democratic rights and we have very few elected councillors. So it's about putting pressure on your district officer and directors of departments to address the issues. I mentioned earlier a technical solution, which was the Smart Harare app, where any resident could take a picture of a burst pipe or pothole or some other issue, and this would be sent to the councillor, the district officer, the works department, and the resident would get regular feedback if council decided to respond. The problem was that there was no pressure on them to respond to the reports, so it was a very one-sided reporting process. But this is important. So organize, get data, make sure we have as much data so our positions and our opinions are based on reality. And then there are some practical, systemic interventions that we should be examining. As I mentioned earlier, the tax base of Harare is very much smaller now than it was 40 years ago. Now we need to look at how do all our citizens contribute in some way to the well-being of the city. There are things like poll taxes where everybody resident in the city would contribute $10 or $20 a year to the city of Harare. Personally, I'm not in favor of poll taxes as they do not distinguish between rich and poor. Far more interesting, I think we should explore the notion of a city tax. This would be a 2.5% sales tax added to that on all transactions within the city, so that the city would directly receive revenue each month based on the commercial life of the city. At the moment, all revenues raised by VAT go directly to central government. There was a constitutional provision that they would devolve, I think, 20% of revenue to the provincial and local levels. However, this has never happened, and government continues to siphon off revenue streams such as the NADA away from local authorities. The city cannot function without adequate revenues, and so we must look at having a local tax, or we must insist that the devolution funds in the Constitution are properly remitted to city authorities. On the question of devolution, which is a very popular thing at the moment, devolution without financial support is meaningless. We can give all the power we want, but if a local authority does not have the funds, it cannot operate. So we need practical, meaningful financial devolution to enable our cities to recover. The City of Harare has recently passed its budget for this year, but the whole process of building a budget is so archaic. Basically, bureaucrats add whatever percentage they feel to the previous year's figures. There are series of rather desultory consultations where 2 or 3 residents might attend. Then the city says they've consulted and they pass the budget. There are far more effective ways in which we should address our budget. These fall under the name of participatory budgeting. This is a well-recognized process and is operating in thousands of cities around the world, where there is a formal process of engagement with residents. Residents get to make financial decisions about how funds are spent in their area. So, for instance, in Ward 8, we might get 20% of all revenues, and then a committee of officials and residents say, we'll spend that on childcare, or we'll spend it on road maintenance, or whatever. But it brings people closer to government, and they feel they are involved in the utilization of their funds. So there are a number of interventions to wonder that could be made. However, it requires the political environment in which to operate to be conducive to progressive and remedial actions. I'm very skeptical that any of these interventions will ever be accepted in the current dispensation, with its emphasis on authoritarianism and centralization of power. This gives rise to the question of what can we do under these conditions? Well, we can continue to operate as citizens. We can look at our footprint, ecological footprint. We can reach out to our neighbors, strengthen them in their struggles, come together, and come up with independent solutions. Many residents' associations are addressing their neighborhood issues through work parties and contributions to tar, to fix a pothole, or wonderful stuff going up in Bari, where they've cleaned rubbish dumps and put in playgrounds. These are really positive things that you, as an individual, can do in your community together with others.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really interesting and practical way of looking at things. So, Mike, my final question for you is, how do you see the future of service delivery in Harare? Service delivery that's both sustainable and inclusive.
I'm not a prophet. It's very difficult to see how this can happen on a systemic basis without systemic change in the national political discourse and environment. In the city itself, what we are seeing and these are signs of the future, an increasing privatization of services. The number of people who have to buy water now has given rise to a huge industry of water trucks driving around town delivering water. This is an area that is fraught with corruption and theft. There are people extracting water from our local flows and selling it in full violation of council rules. So council needs to implement some of the laws. Failing that, residents need to institute legal action against transgressors. So we need to have a more vigorous population that can protect their city. We can protect our neighborhoods. We need to be what council should be. So there's a lot of privatization going on. We've seen this for the last 40 years, from education to health to all sorts of service delivery issues. And people are paying for private rubbish collectors now in Kudales, not in the high-density suburbs. So I think this is a very dangerous precedent. Privatization does not lead to equitable distribution of services. It leads to an increasingly attenuated society of super rich and super poor, with a beleaguered middle class in the middle. As residents, we need to be citizens. It's not enough just to say, I'm a resident, I've got no water, I'm going to have to buy water. No, you as a citizen need to say, I am a citizen. We live in a city which relies on service delivery, and it is the job of the urban authorities to provide these public goods. It's not the job of a private company who is motivated by profit. It is the job of a public entity such as the City of Harare. And if there's not the demand from residents for the City of Harare to fulfill its functions, its core functions, they will get away with it. And the public services will dwindle and decline until we have a situation such as prevails in many areas in Asia and Africa, where all services are privatized. Even your toilets are privatized, and you pay the landlord of the toilet to utilize that. You buy your water from a water vendor who comes with a wheelbarrow and sells bottles of water. So that for me is a gloomy future. It would mean that many of our people are marginalized and alienated from the public enterprise that our city is. We should be working together. We should have a common vision. And that leads me to perhaps the final point. What is the vision in Harare? How do we see the city in 50 or 100 years' time? Most people probably don't give it a thought. They don't think where we're going, they don't know where we've come from, and they're just struggling to exist from day to day. But without this consciousness about what it means to be in a city, what is a city, it can give us huge opportunities for self-improvement and the general improvement of our fellow citizens. So we need to have a greater understanding. Remember, in Zimbabwe, cities are a pretty new phenomenon. They've only been around here for 100 years or so. So there's not a great tradition of being an urbanite, of being an urban dweller. Most people in Harare, I think, if you ask them where their home is, will tell you in Murewa, Dombashala, whatever. They won't say it's Variseko or Chingwiza or whatever. These are places where they reside to come to the city, to extract value, to invest in their wushas, where their real hearts are, where their real homes are. Bulawayo, on the other side of the equation, most people, if you ask in Bulawayo where their home is, they'll say Lobengula or Lubeve or whatever, because they've lived there for generations. They haven't had the massive migration that Harare has. So we need a civic consciousness, I think, Tawanda, and perhaps Harare News should look at promoting ideas of what it means to be a citizen, to be a role member of our city, Harare. And I think that's an important stepping stone to any sea change in the direction in which we are heading.
Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you so much, Tawanda, for inviting me, and I hope to chat again soon.
A small-time district administrator finds himself in hot water when his father asks a favor. The good minister from Kunyarara makes its Harare premiere this month at Reps Theatre in an exciting production where Hollywood meets Zimbabwe. Written by celebrated American playwright and actress June Carroll, The Good Minister from Kunyarara premieres in Harare with the Zimbabwean cast and is directed by Tafazwa Bob Mutumbi and stars Tatiana D. Bumbe, Chipo M. Chikara, Charmaine R. Mujeri, Cedric Musongelwa, and Musa Sivanda. The worldwide premiere of the groundbreaking production will take place from 12 to 15 May 2021 and 19 to 22 May 2021 at Reps Theatre at 6:30 p.m. Tickets are $10. Tickets available through Reps Theatre online booking system Spotlight 0779-604-873. All COVID-19 guidelines and protocols will be observed.
So, Henry, what did you think of what Mike had to say? I mean, some powerful, important information there.
I mean, absolutely. I think it's quite sobering to hear, especially when you listen to people that have been around through the evolution of the city, not just the current evolution, but also the historical evolution, which is a very important story. This is a very important part that we need to think about as residents towards solving our service delivery issues. We have to understand the context that the city's arrived at. We have to understand the context that we find ourselves in that affects exactly why a lot of things don't work. In this case, I think most importantly is a historical and a political context.
Right. Absolutely. There's two different things going on here, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, if maybe I can chime into the two that come out the most. I think first is the historical context. You know, Harare was a colonial city, and this meant that the city was built around the needs and the aspirations of a small minority that was rich and white. And because of that, you know, basic things like you look at our waterworks system, like we talked about in our water episode, was built to accommodate 600,000 people at the time. A maximum of 600,000 people at the time. Today, the same water infrastructure is accommodating and is providing water to 4.5 billion people.
Wow.
And this water system was built in 1952. We're sitting in 2011 and nothing much has changed. So that's one example. You look at our urban housing and the way that was built, our road system, the way that was built, our suburbs, our schools, our hospitals. I mean, a city like Harare is sitting with two major hospitals that are owned by the city. Beatrice Road, Infectious Diseases, and Wilkins. A city of 4.5 million people. I mean, this is exactly why we end up with people going to Parengatwa and Harare Hospital and not getting the care they need. Simply because these facilities were never planned beyond the small group of people that they were built for. So this historical context, and this is just looking at two or three issues, we could go in and look at things like refuse collection, sanitation, the entire spectrum, schools even. The city's supposed to provide education. In any part of the world, there are city schools. We have city schools in Harare, but they haven't been built beyond a significant capacity. So now the cost of education and the availability of good education decreases for residents. So those are some of the practical things that cities need to deal with. And people need to remember that the city of Harare is the second largest entity after the government of Zimbabwe. The second issue is the political culture in our city. The political culture in our city since the mid-90s is now characterized by rampant corruption excessive bureaucracy that sees us spending 80% of our revenue on salaries and nothing else, and secrecy. In other words, residents don't know how much is collected, how much is spent, and what it's spent on. This is a problem that's even affected mayors. I recall very clearly listening to former mayor Ben Mayenyeni speaking about how he was unable to get information from Townhouse. This is the mayor of the city, because within the city, the bureaucrats closely hold what they spend, what they collect, and in the end, that money is misappropriated.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so many things here which have really struck out to me. Most importantly, we are living in a system that, as you say, was built for a minority.
Absolutely.
So it's not just the numbers. It's just even the way the system was initially designed was to accommodate a minority.
Exactly. And if I can just add on that point, Tawanda, you know, people look at the hostels in Bari that now have families, and, you know, you hear stories of 20 people living in one room in Bari, those hostels. Those hostels were designed for men only, who came in to work in the city for the week and went back to the village on the weekend. On the same lines, everything else in the city was built around the black people, the indigenous population, not being allowed to live in the city. So the city gates were almost closed off. So if you worked in the city, in the suburbs, as a domestic worker, for example, you were supposed to go back to the village on the weekend. The same thing with people who worked in factories. They were supposed to stay in hostels or other temporary accommodation and go back on the weekend. So now 1980 comes and we've opened up the city gates. Now it's time for everybody to be able to partake, but the infrastructure is not built like that. That is the point where we were supposed to take the city forward and start building an inclusive and sustainable infrastructure that accommodates everybody and the aspirations of everybody. And this hasn't happened 41 years later.
That's right. So it's not just a question of there's revenue going into the city, it's being mismanaged. There's infrastructure that was developed for a specific time that no longer serves the current moment. What else, taking from what Mike was saying, is an important thing to note in terms of the city of Harare today?
Well, I think the first is, you know, the issue of information, I think, was a very powerful point. I mean, we've touched the political culture and how that's a problem, and that needs to change. I think, in fact, if I can just go back there and say, I think the first thing that needs to change is the political culture. Because when the political culture of how the cities run, how the cities' resources are allocated and collected, when that changes, then we can solve things like the colonial legacy of the city. That's building new things, you know, that's building new water systems, that's building new sanitation systems. All of that is possible if there's a change in political culture and there's a political will to do so. In other words, all that is possible if you have officials that want to do the job and do it right. And that's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a situation where the people that run the city don't care. And this issue of town clerks getting paid $15,000, $20,000 a month was I think this was in the papers 3-4 years ago, and it's still the case. If you go to the City of Harare today, I can bet my bottom dollar that people are being paid more than they should be. You know, more than is competitive, more than is even applicable to the private sector. I mean, city directors make so much money. Just a recent case that happened when the Morton Jeffrey loan from Chinese Export-Import Bank was given, $144 million was allocated for water treatment and to fix the water plants. $10 million was spent on buying city directors new cars.
Wow.
You know, so that's the culture. That's the culture we have in the city of Harare. Who comes first is the city directors, is the guys at the top. Forget about why they got there in the first place. If they wanted to make so much money, they should go become entrepreneurs or go work in the private sector. But this is public service. This is public service. These are goods for the public good.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to note that in order for the city to function, people need to work together to make things work. Whether it's City of Harare delivering service that we pay for, but also us as residents, as communities, we need to hold people accountable so that the service happens.
Absolutely. But I think, when it comes to the issue of accountability, one of the most important things we need that Mike mentioned is the issue of vigorous, strong, vibrant community groups and resident associations. Harare has got 47 wards. Imagine if we had 47 strong, vibrant resident associations going to their district offices every single week and telling the district administrators what they need.
Yeah.
Going to Rowan Martin building, going to Townhouse and demanding service delivery. Also the issue of community groups, Community Water Alliance, again as an example, environmental groups, speaking about wetlands. We just saw people lose their lifetime investments when their homes were washed away in the recent rains. People lose their lifetime investments. We've seen people lose their lifetime investments when the city goes and destroys people's houses. We've seen vendors get booted out the streets trying to make ends meet in a living. These are all the issues that people have to deal with, but we need groups around all these issues to represent. Now, if the issue of vendors is about them not be selling produce to the right place, then give them somewhere to do business. Vendors, after all, are business people. They're not these people that are just sitting on the street trying to be a nuisance. These are everyday people looking after families. These are everyday people who need to make ends meet in the current economic climate. Give them somewhere to sell their goods. Don't chase them away and throw their things in a truck and beat them. So we need people to be represented at every level. And we need groups. We need people to come together and form these groups that represent people. And the other issue that I really liked is the issue of the city tax. I mean, in many cities around the world, cities have taxes that are separate from national taxes. If there's a city tax of 2.5%, it makes sense. Then that goes entirely to service delivery. But again, it's very difficult to institute those measures without a change in political culture. Because the next thing, we are paying a 2.5% tax. The next thing, that money is going and is being spent on new cars, on political rallies. It's being spent on all sorts of things apart from our roads, our water, our refuse collection, our sanitation.
Absolutely. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is understanding that we are a community. We're a community of 4 million people. But each of us need to understand that if you have a problem, if my neighbor has a problem, then I have a problem. We all have the same problems, and we need to work together to figure out how to fix them.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, Henry.
Pleasure, Tawanda. Pleasure. It was a great discussion, and I look forward to having many more like this.
We've come to the end of this episode of the Fix Harare podcast, brought to you by Harare News. Please look out for the next episode, which will be available on Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Anchor, as well as on Facebook and Twitter on our handle @Harare News. You can also send the message JOIN to 0786 580 574 to subscribe to receive the Fix Harare podcast via WhatsApp. Until next week, goodbye from us here at the Fix Harare podcast.